How to decide if your team is truly championship ready heading into the 2025 Dynasty season. We have a very interesting question and topic coming in from one of our listeners, Stephen, today on the show. We're going to look through a team that he describes as being very deep, but he's wondering, is it in danger of just being a deep roster with, not enough top end talent to push him towards that championship in 2025. So I'm looking forward to talking through this one. And again, as I always mention, we do like to get different topics, different questions in from listeners because they be slightly unique to other people listening into the show. Stephen, in his question here, references that people who are perpetually reloading their rosters and listeners of RotoViz OT may have similar scenarios with their own teams that they're working through. And again, as I mentioned, every time a question like this would come in, Shawn, it's very hard for us to sit here and be like, I know what people are thinking about. It's about a team that's really, really loaded, but is it just not loaded enough to win a championship, and what do they need to do? So looking forward to that. But Shawn, as we kick off Dynasty drafts, the rookie draft, the NFL draft, not that far away. You can almost, feel those seconds ticking down on the rookie draft clock at this particular time. And in fact, one of our teams, Shawn, together, we are on the clock because we have the 101 and we're willing to accept offers if people want to send any our way. We might talk about trades and maneuvering off the picks later in the show, but the draft, I joked on the show earlier this week, was the case that we were waiting for it to be here, but you rightly put me in my place and said, kind of savor these moments as we get ready to approach the draft. We'll be waiting 12 months for the next one to come around. So I am now patiently waiting for the draft to kick off in 3 weeks' time.
That's what I love to hear. One day, 1 week at a time. We'll want all those days back sometime down the line. But no, we're getting pretty feisty, pretty fiery when it gets to this impending NFL draft.
Yeah, so we do have a question that comes in from Stephen. He says, "Hi, RotoViz OT squad. Some favorable words about the shows and the content. We do appreciate that, Stephen. But he has a dynasty roster that he feels good about, but this offseason feels like a pivotal spot to make a big move. So it is a 10-team Superflex head-to-head format with standard Triflex starting lineups, 25-man rosters, 3 additional taxi squads. So you get a lot of depth in there. You get a lot less on the waiver wire, obviously, in those formats. And I think, Shawn, when you move down to 10-team versus 12-team, I think having the larger rosters can be beneficial in that way. But it is half-point PPR, is 0.7 tight end premium with some big play bonuses as well. So there's a lot of different elements. But again, when we get into the question of the team, a lot of it will filter into the same information. So quarterback is Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, Bo Nix, Jared Goff. Running back is Chuba Hubbard, Chase Brown, Ramondre Stevenson, Javonte Williams, Blake Corum, Damian Pierce, Isaiah Davis. Wide receivers, Jamar Chase, Jerry Jeudy, Jordan Addison, Brandon Aiyuk, Josh Downs, Marvin Mims, Hollywood Brown. Tank Dell obviously going to miss the majority or all of this upcoming season. The rest of the players, unfortunately, Shawn, we get down to Traylon Burks, not really worth discussing in huge detail. But tight end, Brock Bowers, TJ Hawkinson, Michael Mayer. And then they have a lot of picks in this upcoming draft, the 104, the 106, the 108, 203. And then they have the 204, 304, 404, and 504. And obviously, the 203 would be the equivalent of the 201 if it was a 12-team league because of the 2 teams less making those selections. When we look at this roster, Shawn, and his question does come into, he mentions here, it could be a situation where other dynasty managers find themselves in similar ways while executing a perpetual reload strategy. There comes a time where the team is approaching a window where it could use some extra juice, and he's trying to find a way to do that while managing the rosters as well. Is there merit in trading some of the draft capital or even packaging a quarterback like Kyler Murray to move up in the draft for Ginty, or trading for a wide receiver like Garrett Wilson to fill out the wide receiver room? Or is it simply wise to be patient, loading up on running backs and a strong running back class and riding the team as it is? His question, he says, boils down to, is this team in danger of being too, and in quotation marks, deep, but not strong enough to really compete for titles? And does he need to make some bold moves this offseason? So we have the team overall here to look through. We have the picks and the draft compensation that he has this year. And I'm going to leave the door open for you as to how we set this overall discussion up. Firstly, Shawn, the roster itself, he mentions about the depth. When we look at the wide receiver room, the one player that we haven't really talked about this offseason at all has kind of been vanished from our minds, I think. And now there's no Deebo Samuel with the San Francisco 49ers. There's a chance that Brandon Aiyuk also won't be with the San Francisco 49ers post NFL draft. But Brandon Aiyuk had the season-ending injury last year, signed the contract in the offseason prior, before the season kicked off, then had the injury. What's your outlook on Aiyuk before we dive specifically into the team itself?
Well, he was someone we were trying to move everywhere last year when his value, not that it was at an all-time high, it was certainly possible that he would get that contract. He would come out, he would sort of consolidate what he had done and move his value up to a slightly higher plateau that he could hold for a bit. But I mean, obviously that opportunity is now gone. The injury and some of the things that the 49ers have certainly implied about him don't suggest that they necessarily see him as being
it almost, like, it seems like they almost said, I know the injury can play a part in this, but it seemed like they almost said, buyer's remorse once the ink had dried in that contract.
That was a weird one where there was a big psychological element at play, I believe, where they didn't want Aiyuk to force them into a move that was on his timeline and at his behest, as opposed to their move. And then especially when they discussed it with other teams, they didn't want those teams to also beat them in the trade. Although they had something set up that Aiyuk was then, no, I don't want to do that. Right.
Yeah.
And so you look at all those things, I'm sure that they wish that they had just gotten that trade to go. Aiyuk is one of these guys who is certainly a good player when healthy, but when you look at his overall trajectory, it's probably not to the level that, I mean, he was smart to get the contract, right? Because he in part probably understood that a lot of what's happening here is he's a good fit with the 49ers, and the 49ers really inflate efficiency. And so when you have that level of efficiency, you look like a star in a way that probably isn't completely justified. Now, is Brandon Aiyuk a good receiver? I think that he very clearly is. He's got some athleticism. There are certain parts of his profile where at times he looks like a very good route runner. You can see that in some of the metrics that track that particular element. So I think that you have a good player here. The problem is that now his value is down and he's not going to necessarily be available for you for a chunk of the season that matters, right? Now, we're not necessarily prioritizing the first third or the first half of the season, and yet you want the value for players to be growing during that time period. If you're taking on picks, you want those picks to be valuable in the future. If you're adding young players and you're going to have to be patient, that's a little bit different deal than simply having someone whose value is down and you're not going to get contributions. If you could move him, you probably would, right? You also don't want to sell low. So it's an unfortunate dead spot in the roster for people who have Brandon Aiyuk. I think you want to be flexible in your mindset with that. If you do get a good trade offer, go ahead and take it, remove some risk. If you don't, you simply have to be patient and think, this is a championship level team. When do I need guys the most for that type of roster? Well, it's during the type of the year that we hope Aiyuk will be an impact player again.
The other part as well, he's just turned 27, but if you don't move him this season, during the season or this off season, you're going to be in a situation then where you're moving into potentially a post-injury 28-year-old wide receiver who's underperforming, and the value can start to disappear quite quickly in those particular situations. Shawn, firstly, before we go into this team specific, the question around depth versus top-end talent on a roster. Obviously, you would like to have all top-end talent and have it very deep on your roster. But what is your kind of thought on the top-end true difference makers on a roster versus having that depth and trying to find the right balance there?
Part of it, I think, is a humility-based decision where you can go through some different seasons and get a little bit frustrated. You look at 2023 and 2024 and just how different they were. Where in 2023, you had a lot of titles won by relatively unappealing veterans. I say unappealing simply that the right move from a big picture perspective, from a multi-year, 10-year, 20-year perspective, would have been to move those guys. And then the people you moved them to benefited from health, a conspicuous lack of decline that you might have expected. In some cases, benefited from scoring during the time of the season that was the most important. And you're looking at that and saying, well, number one, I wish I hadn't reloaded. And number two, I wish I had these guys who were creating some of these marginal advantages at their position as opposed to having some of the younger players. You flash forward to 2024 and you think about, some of the guys on this roster and some of the guys on some of other rosters where names like a Jerry Jeudy, someone we've been waiting on for a while and continuing to kind of take shots on, he comes through in a big way sort of overall and has a lot of that production backloaded to times of the year that make a difference. Now, you did have a little bit of the switcheroo at the very end too, that maybe created some issues depending on if you started him or not in week 17. But you have that. You have Jordan Addison, who comes through and over the second half of the season there is really putting up some of his biggest scores. One of the players that I had on a ton of rosters and was very helpful in a way that wasn't guaranteed was a Jamison Williams. For a lot of these guys, what you're really hoping, or the thesis that you may have had when you traded for them, was 2025. And yet they already won for you there in 2024. And so then you're thinking, okay, well, not only does perpetual reloading work, but it works earlier and faster in a bigger way than I was even hoping for. Both of those things are probably a little bit wrong in that they are focusing only on one specific season that doesn't reflect the entire project. But I do think that as long as you're going after guys like a Jordan Addison, who is just undervalued, you're going after someone like a Jerry Jeudy, who at some point people thought was going to be one of these impact players, and then he falls and falls and falls, even though the peripherals indicate that it's probably other guys on the team that are causing that and not Jeudy himself. He bounces back up. The thing with Williams, you're talking about a guy who was an early first-round draft pick. If you have the right types of profiles on your roster, then I think you have to be willing to be patient and understand that, A, we don't know exactly when people are going to make the jump, and B, we don't know exactly when people are going to score. Right? That's one of the reasons that people have now fallen in love with drafting best ball teams, where you draft tens, if not 50s, if not hundreds, if not thousands of rosters. And you're like, across all of that, I'm kind of covered, right? I mean, I know players are going to score some points, and they're probably going to score with all these rosters I have in a way that I can at least point to one team and say, well, this was fun. In Dynasty, you have to be, well, you either have to play 50 to 100 rosters in the same way, or you have to be willing to accept a little bit of a level of uncertainty in order to put the roster together in a way that allows you to consistently get buys, to consistently make the playoffs, and then be in position to win when your guys hit. You even think of someone like a Bo Nix last year, or in many ways, again, that was not a pick for 2024, but it worked out in 2024 anyway.
Yep. That's all good points. So when we work into this team, Shawn, being the form that it's in, it's 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, a tight end, and 2 flex spots, along with a super flex in addition. So technically, this team will be starting 2 quarterbacks using that super flex spot. You could go up to 6 wide receivers if you wanted to use that super flex spot. You also could go to the 5 running back. So the question then, when we move into it, you had a question around the depth of the running back class, and should you kind of ride running back, looking at Chase Brown, Chuba Hubbard, even I know you talked with Shawn on Stealing Bananas in the last couple of weeks, talking about Ramondre as a possible kind of bounce back candidate at his value. The Patriots, there has been reports around them looking, and I think at all the teams are looking at the running backs in this class with the depth that's available, but looking for a pass catching running back was some of the reports coming out in New England. You get Javonte Williams now with the Dallas Cowboys, but reports again that they're looking to add through the draft as well. But when we look at the names there and we look at the picks that is available, are you thinking that this is a team that should be looking to potentially do that and add in the running backs, or do you think with the running backs we should be adding them onto the rosters but still trying to mainly build these teams through the wide receiver talent?
Steven's team is pretty cool here, and he sort of describes the QB depth is good and the talent is fine, but maybe not difference making, which does underline this dynamic that we currently have in the NFL, where those true high-end hybrid QBs score so many points that everybody else is going to be left a little bit in the dust, at least in seasons where those guys are healthy. And yet when I look at these 4 players, I see 4 interesting profiles that also do have upside to them. Now you can look at Joe Burrow and Jared Goff and say, even in seasons where they were the best passers in the NFL, they didn't put up huge numbers, but it is helpful to have guys, if you have passing oriented QBs, that are going to, in all likelihood, put up big yardage numbers and then potentially touchdown numbers, and you can play them to an extent with matchups, and you're insulated from a simple injury torpedoing your entire season. Because with the half PPR instead of the full PPR, this isn't really a super flex, as you mentioned. It's really more just of a straight 2 QB league. Now, the super flex dynamic does mean that in an emergency, you can play position players, but you really wouldn't want to do that, right?
Yeah.
And so having the 4 is fantastic. And then with Kyler Murray, you could have the hybrid element break back out to a higher scoring level than what we've seen recently. And then with Bo Nix, you possibly have that. So I think the QB situation here is fantastic. Now, one of the things we do
question on that, Shawn, with the Kyler Murray, my recommendation would be to have no Kyler Murray in Dynasty moving forward. And that's me putting it kindly. I think that we're past the point of any further development in him as a quarterback. It's like he's well beyond the young player entering the league stage. He's into the veteran who has been in the league, and we kind of know what he is, and we know that he has a lot of flaws, and we will each season probably see a 30 to 50 yard rushing touchdown that kind of drags you back in with the rushing points and that it gets you that week. But over the course of a season, he's no longer somebody that I want to really roster on my dynasty teams. Am I being too harsh on Kyler Murray? I don't see that transition to you're not going to Bo Nix, you're good rookie season, and there's a trajectory that he can continue to improve, and you can give him that kind of benefit of the doubt. I really don't have any benefit of the doubt for Kyler's future development to build on what we've seen so far.
Well, I mean, you're forcing a Kyler Murray reality skeptic to push back on this idea that Kyler Murray is not a great fantasy asset. I do think it's a big problem that they use that pick on Marvin Harrison and not only do not get a generational player, but don't get much impact at all. I would expect that to change in year 2. I would expect them to make adjustments within the context of the overall offense. I would expect Marvin Harrison to take a jump. I would expect Kyler Murray to have a better feel for how to unlock the talent that is there. But the problem is that we established a low enough baseline that you need pretty meaningful jumps to get this to where this can be a dynamic passing offense, which you do need to complement the running. Now, in part because he stayed healthy and played 17 games, Murray did have his second highest rushing yardage total last year and scored 5 touchdowns, which also ties for the second highest at the TD level. You'd really like for him to get back to where he was in 2020, where he scored the 11 rushing touchdowns. That's probably not realistic, but somewhere in that 7 or 8 range, in between the 11 and the 5, which is the second highest, I think that's possible. You look at 2020, you look at 2021, the per game ranking there at QB is number 6 and number 5. it's going to be tough to get back there. But I do think that you have a guy who you can realistically say, this is going to be like the QB8. And if you have that, then, I mean, that's a big value in what's essentially a 2 QB format. I also think because we don't have a lot of information about how these rushing QBs are going to age, that there is the potential for Murray to jump back into that, say, QB7, QB8 range and actually rehabilitate his trade value, because people aren't thinking about how the rushing portion of that will age. That you might be able to move him at better prices a year from now or even 2 years from now, after you've benefited from that time period, to where this is probably, wouldn't say buy Kyler Murray, but a hold, and then you can profit from it in a couple of years. But I mean, I agree with you that his reality limitations are going to weigh on the Cardinals, weigh on his receivers, and weigh on fantasy managers more and more as it becomes clearer and clearer that those limitations are just purely a part of who he is, as opposed to something that is happening during a short-term window, et cetera, et cetera. I think that what you're talking about is definitely a concern. I guess within, again, this mix of 4 players, I'm not that worried about him.
Okay. He would be one of the players I'd be looking to move to,
You're like, sell.
Well, I'm looking at Kyler. The only thing that I feel like is holding fantasy value for him is the Russian side. You mentioned like how that's going to work as he ages, but if it's a case that there falls off, or let's say unfortunately has an injury this season, I think the value can just disappear off a cliff here for him. The one other part that I'm saying it's kind of holding him there, where you're like, well, maybe there is a chance that happens. They are locked in basically for the next 3 years with Kyler Murray as their QB. 2020, it's kind of the realistic chance of them, getting an out here on this one from the contract that he signed. So they're going to be locked into him. But if this was a case that the contract was any more, wiggle room for the team, I think that the team, the Cardinals, that is, should be looking at ways to potentially move Kyler. That's how I'm completely out, Shawn, all the way out, not getting back in. So that was the quarterback position kind of reviewed. For Shawn says keep the 4. I'm thinking if you can do something where somebody in the league is intrigued by Kyler, I would be looking to see what I could do with that. For the wide receivers, you went down through some of the names, and Josh Downs is somebody I think, if we get Shawn's boy Daniel Jones as the QB down there with the Colts, I think could open up and be an interesting play. But when we move down past Jordan Addison, Brandon Aiyuk, then we get into Josh Downs, Marvin Mims. I mentioned the names below that: Hollywood Brown, Butte, Tank Dell, Michael Wilson, Yoshivas, and Treylon Burks. There isn't a huge amount of depth there at the wide receiver position in general, and the rookie draft is going to be challenging, to get that additional depth and pieces in this class. The wide receiver position, and then when we look at the draft capital that is available, would there be some, would you be reaching out to managers in your league to see if you could move that, 106 or 108, or even some of those, second or third round picks for some potential, veteran wide receivers to try and fill out this group? Or how are you feeling about the overall wide receiver group?
The receiver group is going to depend a little bit on how comfortable you are trying to fill those flexes with other positions. So, I mean, you asked me about the running backs. I kind of pivoted to QBs as the foundation for saying this is the position that's deep, and then tight end is the other position that you have 2 really strong players, which you could argue for tight end is deep, right? The other 2 positions, especially in a 10-team league, and so this is the also interesting element of, do you have enough upside? Because the quality of a team that you need to win a 10-team league is not guaranteed, but is likely to be even significantly greater than the quality of team that you need to win a 12-team league. So you do have to have that firepower. Within that context, the team is very interesting, but needs players. And so a lot of the depth actually comes from the fact that you have 5 early picks. And once you add those 5 early picks, now the team looks deep. When I'm thinking about where the value is in this draft, it's almost entirely at running back. And it's also the position where the most need is. I'm hoping that the Patriots don't ruin Ramondre Stevenson, but there's a strong likelihood of that. I do think there's a chance that Blake Corum could end up having, he has got good contingent value now. There's a possibility that that contingent value manifests in some extremely meaningful real value at some point during the season. But you basically just have 2 guys that you would feel comfortable playing in a 10-team league where you're thinking, I'm going to have the best team, I'm going to win this league. And those would be Chase Brown and Chuba Hubbard. And even those guys maybe don't match, again, this idea of what other teams are going to be able to start. So you just have the running back position filled. You don't have the flexes addressed. And if you have an injury, now you don't have the running back position even that strongly addressed. So I think really hammering running back is the way to go. And then this idea of, can we pivot to the receivers? The receiver, I think, is a pretty interesting position. It's hurt a lot by the fact that Aiyuk and Dell are hurt. Colm, when you say make a move for some veterans, are you thinking that because there are going to be drafters out there who really like Luther Burden, there are going to be drafters out there that really like Matthew Golden, that you're going to be able to get, especially if you throw in some other type of piece, that you're going to be able to get a big name, big impact wide receiver who is maybe peak age, as opposed to trading for maybe a mid wide receiver too, who's on the older side?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the other play, like to go back to Kyler again, like if you're in a format like this where it is basically start 2 quarterbacks, you are going to be able to get some of the top maybe 3 in terms of you're not going to probably go in there and get yourself Justin Jefferson with some of these players, but you're going to be able to go into the tiers below that and potentially work your way in to maybe even a Rashee Rice or an AJ Brown, Devontae Smith, those kind of names. T. Higgins, for example. You mentioned Jameson Williams, Zay Flowers. They're sort of players that I'd be thinking that you could go in and try and work your way through. It's going to obviously depend on your league mates and who they want to get with those potential picks. But I would be thinking of filling in more players on this team with that kind of Jordan Addison, Jerry Jeudy tier of Dynasty wide receiver and try and fill it out that way to have 4 to 5 of those names to build out the depth overall.
I would agree with that. I think that Downs and Mims are interesting enough that they probably give you some coverage and some ability to at least see what's going to happen as the season progresses.
But you kind of want them to be your at least 5th and 6th wide receivers, because Mims finished the season very strong, but we still have to see how the season opens up. I would love if that's the continued trajectory, but it might not be as smooth as we've seen him, really finishing at the end of the season. And the same I kind of mentioned there with Downs. I think if Downs was in a situation where he had a different quarterback that we were guaranteed to have starting, there'll be a lot more positive outlook on him. It's just that with Richardson, if he is the starter, it really kind of sinks a lot of the wide receiver value in Indianapolis. But if he has somebody who's going to be able to get the ball out there on target, I think Downs is somebody who, there's a pathway to him really developing into a useful fantasy asset as well. But at the moment, there is the question marks around that. So when you look at this roster, you really have Chase, Jeudy, and Addison, and below that, then you're kind of seeing where it fills out. But if you were to add a T. Higgins to this or Devontae Smith, then you have the freedom to kind of wait for those guys to go through, because if you get an off-season injury to Jerry Jeudy or Jordan Addison, and then we also know that Jerry Jeudy's playing in a very unpredictable quarterback environment, I would like to have that. And that's kind of the tier that I would be targeting rather than trying to jump all the way up and getting some of the top tier names. I think those guys that you're looking at, kind of tier 3 names like the T. Higgins, Jameson Williams, those names that I mentioned, I think you can go in. And Burden, for example, is probably going to be valued in a similar range to those guys, but I would rather have those guys over him.
I think all of that makes sense. I think that with this type of roster, and again, for anybody who's listening and not thinking about this roster specifically, but the way to try to game this is to figure out how you can address the starting lineup spots, make sure that you still have contingencies in place for injuries or underperformance, and then how do we perpetually reload on top of that? So one of the ways I would try to game this would be to think of the 2 running back, 3 wide receiver, 2 flex as potentially being 4 running back and just the 3 wide receiver. It feels weird to say that when we just discussed that running back is the weakest spot. But if you have Chase Brown and Chuba Hubbard, you're going to throw those guys out there, and then you're going to draft running backs with the first 2 picks. You can throw those 2 players in right into the fire instantly as well, hit those 2 flex spots, and then you only need to have Chase, Judy, and Addison actually in the starting lineup. Now, the additional
you also could
Addison
go
is you
with
have a potential suspension there.
You also could go with the Byers and Hawkinson as well. Have the 2 of those guys in, and then you would just start the 3 running backs.
Exactly. That's another great way to look at it, because the 106, maybe that running back you're not wanting to start in week 1, but the 203, the 2 and 4, I would take those as running backs as well, which then gets you the additional depth again to be able to address running back, but also to address these flex positions. And the 108, or if the 106, if you have a lot more interest in that and you know that the essentially equivalent type of player at the position you want will be available at 108, the 106 or the 108, those are the picks that I would look to try and flip into 2026 along with additional compensation. That's the way you can keep the perpetual reload going. And I think that even if you move either the 106 or the 108 into next year, you should have enough firepower with the other 4 picks to put together a starting lineup that is both high scoring enough to be competitive overall, but that also gives you a chance to wait on guys like Aiyuk getting healthy or some of the more contingent plays to develop actual starting lineup value as the season goes along.
Yeah, so I think we've gone through a lot of the ins and outs of the roster and what potential changes. I always try and leave the way we talk about it then kind of more generalized, even using the team, but so it's applicable to as many people listening as we can. But Shawn, as we get ready to finish up on this team, any other final thoughts in general as to, I think we've covered a lot of it. I would be trying to add to the wide receiver room, draft your running backs through the draft, potentially even move back on some of them selections that you mentioned. I can't remember now. We've recorded these shows back. I can't remember if it was the end of the first show that we recorded this week, but talking about that kind of early 2nd round range has been a really prime spot in this draft to select those running backs. And if you look at the way his picks are going to be picked up here, it's going to be like that, that 204 and 203 are still really in that range. So there's a lot of ways to play it. But any final thoughts on what we could do here with Steven's team?
No, I think it looks good. We have another question asking about having the 101, the 105, the 106, trying to do best player available, wide receiver or running back. Calling it 101, you have GT, and it's just really hard to get away from that. The 105, 106, when we talked with Scott, he was pretty adamant. I think you and I are pretty adamant. We do like the running back position, but I also think there's a possibility of simply trading back or trading out. In the long show that Ben and I did on the running backs, I discussed the possibility that the backs in that next tier are equivalent or better. Anytime that you move back and don't get what you're looking for, you have this real remorse associated with it. But when you don't move back and take advantage of getting, say, Brian Thomas or Bo Nix at the edge of the 1st and 2nd round, then you're like, why didn't I take those guys and get all of the additional things as well? You want to think through both of those elements. Having said that, probably don't move back if Travion Henderson is still on the board. Based on where quarterbacks go, he might still be in the middle of the 1st round.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it as well is going to be, league mates, league situation, team needs around you maybe, and knowing your league mates' tendencies as to what you might be able to move back and get there. But as we mentioned at the start of the show, Shawn, it is not long till we will be, putting names to those picks, making those selections, and I am very excited to be getting to that point now in the next couple of weeks as we get to do that prep, do some rookie mock drafts and so on. But that is where we're going to close it out for this edition of RotoViz OT. You can obviously get these shows once they're available by subscribing to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed. You can also find them up usually a day or two later on the RotoViz YouTube channel. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. You can check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com and in the RotoViz Rookie Guide. And until we are back, have a good one.